Welcome back, and we're continuing the conversation here at the Berlin Global Dialogue. It's good to be in the house with you all this morning. I see some smiles, but not everybody's smiling. I'm happy to see you. Not everybody looks happy to see me, but nonetheless, I think we're due for some good conversation. My name is Mhundwa, and I'm very privileged to be steering this conversation, this part of the dialogue for us. It's really a great pleasure to be taking part at the very first Berlin Global Dialogue. And of course, we set the scene for if there's going to be a comeback. So let's do very well so that we can all be back in Berlin next year, continuing the conversation. At this juncture, we want to have a bit of a leaders' dialogue on the worldwide economic shocks that we're experiencing and the impact that that's having, particularly on the global south. Ladies and gentlemen, as we speak today, more than half of the world's developing countries are currently in debt distress, or they're headed towards debt distress. That is the reality for a number of countries in the global south today. And part of the conversation here at the Berlin Global Dialogue is, of course, bringing the perspective of all regions of the world. And so I'm very happy to, not only as a young voice, be steering this conversation, but also getting the representation of the part of the world that I come from, and really putting our heads together in terms of taking this opportune moment to bringing us the solutions that we need to resolve some of the challenges that we're experiencing. I don't want to say much more other than to introduce our special guest this morning. We thought it would be great to perhaps start with a bit of a case study, and that will be the country of Sri Lanka, which, if you have been watching the news or reading the news over the last few years, you'd know that Sri Lanka has been experiencing an economic crisis, an unprecedented one, since the island gained its independence. And I'm pleased to tell you all today that we have a special guest in. The president of Sri Lanka is going to be here today to open this session for us with some remarks. I'm going to do something he does not like. He doesn't allow it back home, and call him His Excellency. His Excellency Ranil Wickremesinghe, President of Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, may we please put our hands together as he makes his way to the podium. I asked how his flight was on the way here, and Mr. President told me he was fast asleep the whole way, but he made it here in one piece, so it clearly went really well. We're pleased to have you, Mr. President. The floor is yours.
Call me His Excellency. I'm going to fine you a few more minutes.
I've been fined already for that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Chair, Madam Moderator, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, I must begin by thanking Professor Rowe, Chairman of the Berlin Global Dialogue, for inviting me to this inaugural session. Where the way I look at it, the global economy has many shocks since in the last 2 decades. Starting from 2008, we've gone through a series of the European debt crisis, then we've had the COVID-19 pandemic, and the economic shocks that have come from it, the whole issue of funding for climate change, and the sovereign debt crisis. I don't think in any other period of modern history have we gone through this type of a crisis. And in all these instances, it's the developing economies and the global south that has suffered disproportionately. We are now faced with stubbornly high inflation in advanced economies, oil prices edging towards US $100 a barrel, and monetary tightening by the global central banks. One example is that Sri Lanka's exports to Europe has not increased at all this year, so far this year. That's an indication of how we are being affected as we try to recover from the crisis we face. The confluence of factors spells serious risk for many developing countries. In the global south, we are facing rising import costs food, energy, insecurity, and the problems of our exports. The resulting balance of payment stress translates into a weaker economy for all of us. The difference between the advanced economies and the developing nations is that you all have all the buffers and reserves to deal with these shocks. We haven't. And it's from here that the sovereign debt crisis started. In this context, I think the world may be on the cusp of another crisis if corrective measures are not taken immediately. Many developing countries find themselves with large debt burdens. For example, IMF has no mechanism to face this new situation. When Sri Lanka declared bankruptcy, all foreign funding ceased. And that started the political crisis. If not for the help given by World Bank in regraduating Sri Lanka and the help given by my old friend Samantha Powers in funding us with fertilizers, the chances are that I would not be able to come here today. I would not have been in the position. It's so bad. And there's no way in which you can help any country which declares bankrupt. But in this case, especially, I am glad that Germany is doing its part as the largest culminative contributor to the Green Climate Fund. We have both the climate change mitigation and debt restructuring, both of which we have to handle with minimum funds available. The funding on the table is woefully inadequate to address the vast challenges at hand. So we haven't got any money, but we do have 100 billion with the IMF. Let's start with that money. 100 billion is better than nothing. Then let's see how we can raise the rest of it, because though I talk of Sri Lanka, I must say Africa's need, especially of the low-income countries, are far greater than ours. And the problems Africa faces need not be described by me, because I think there are enough representatives here. The developing countries require financing up to US 5.9 trillion to fulfill their nationally determined contributions. Then a further US 4 trillion annum for clean energy technology to achieve net zero emissions. Look at Sri Lanka's financing needs. For our climate prosperity plan to succeed, we need 26.5 billion US dollars by 2030. These for a country that's bankrupt, and who the IMF states will have for the next few years a growth rate of 3.5%, if we are lucky. Here again, global coordination and leadership to resolve these challenges have simply not been sufficient to address the magnitude of the urgency of the problem. So what we need here is a new architecture. Now we've been talking of the many crises and shocks we have discussed today are interlinked. And we've been talking of what we have to do. First, we've all agreed that the core of the international financial architecture today was designed almost 80 years ago. The world has seen dramatic changes since then, with many emerging economies in Asia, Middle East, South America, and Africa becoming global economic powerhouses. However, the international architecture has seen relatively mild reforms. The international financial architecture available makes the debt restructuring too complex. This we have all agreed on. The magnitude of the challenges discussed today requires ambitious action. Developing nations will not be able to mobilize the financing required to combat climate change. There is an urgent need for a significant increase in the envelope of concessional financing made available through the multilateral development banks. The MDB assets are considerable. It can be deployed in risk mitigating instruments. Tax havens are still left out of this question. Why don't we bring them in the same sanctions we have applied to Russia? There are many. The concession and financing should be accessible by a broader group of countries, including the middle-income nations facing numerous economic vulnerabilities. In the depth of Sri Lanka's economic crisis of 2022, even though the country was implementing robust IMF-supported reforms, the country could not access any new foreign concessional financing due to its situation or debt distress. I must tell you that the negotiations with the IMF is certainly not tailored for these situations. It's still the old way of negotiating. So what do we require? I think we have a whole lot of proposals, starting from the Bridgetown Initiative onwards, as how to deal with it. The Paris Climate Summit is preparing a roadmap. Now, I'm not going to add anything more to it. All I'm saying is choose from this. Let's act. But it's aggravated because the developing countries, to emerge from the prevailing economic challenges, including debt requests, a critical requirement is open access to trade, investment, capital, technology flows. But unfortunately, the great power rivalries and geopolitics have been an emerging threat for such market success. The Washington consensus was rejected in Jake Sullivan's address at the Brookings Institute, with new concept of de-risking and decoupling. The developing South, which was compelled to follow the Washington consensus, is now asked to do a 180-degree turn even without consultation with us. Since decoupling and since the Brookings speech, whatever it is, we have been asked to change the system. We were compelled to get into it. Now we are told this is no longer relevant. Furthermore, Belt and Road Initiative has been labeled as a cohesive program, and the participating countries like Sri Lanka is looked upon with suspicion. This will further hurt economic prospects in the global South, and the polarization will become more evident. For a country like Sri Lanka, we are learned to live with pressure from America, India, and China. I mean, that's nothing new for us anymore. The United States is witnessing an acrimonious run-up to the 2024 election year, which will detract from its ability to lead in this instance. It is creating a vacuum, because if US wants a new order, US must lead. But we know from now onwards till end of next year, that leadership will gradually reduce as they start focusing more and more on their 2024 elections. So then what happens to the rest of us? Then, on the other hand, you are finding a challenge to G7 and G7 and Quad, which is the expansion of the BRICS, what we call the BRICS Plus. The South is now looking for alternative leadership. And we can see the G20 has been downgraded. So in this situation, are we going to act in 2024? Let's talk. It's useless giving any more solutions. It's what are we going to face. We know in 2024, the US leadership may not be there. Then who is going to act? So I think it's a chance for the EU to come up and work with the other countries. There's no one else. So I am suggesting that EU, together with G20, BRICS, certainly USA, and some selected other Asian and African nations not represented, the IMF and the NDBs, and you can bring in the big financial institutions, private ones, sit down and find urgent solutions. We are talking of the Summit for the Future. Summit for the Future is in September next year. Elections are in November next year. So I can't see a Summit for the Future bringing anything out before the elections take place in 2024. But 2024 is the year to act. We are watching 2024. And whether we can come up with a new international architecture that better reflects the global realities of today and provides effective representation for those who need it. So we have the resources, we have the solutions, we just need the willpower to decide how it's going to be done. It has to be done urgently. We require a constructive dialogue between the West and China. We need a constructive dialogue between US and China. We need a constructive dialogue between EU and China. Otherwise, we will not move forward. So this is the stark reality. It's a question of how we get together and how we work, and who's going to take the lead in 2024? Thank you.
We are going over here. Thank you for that scene setter, Mr. President. That is your seat over there. And I'll ask my other panelists, my fellow panelists, to please join me now at the round table. When they've all made their way here, I will introduce them.
This is Martín.
Yeah. Martin, that's your seat. I won't bother with left and right because depending on where you're sitting, it's different. But I will start by saying Vera Songwe chairs the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility. They're doing good work over there to support the liquidity of African sovereign bonds, among other things. That's part of your dual mandate there. Samy Muaddi is head of emerging markets fixed income at T. Rowe Price. His team is responsible for about $25 billion, I think it is, Samy, of debt investments in developing nations. And immediately next to me here is Martín Guzmán, former Minister of Economy in Argentina. He's currently visiting professor at Columbia University. And I know that as President was speaking over there, you were probably recalling your time in office, Martin, because you had a critical role in Argentina's debt restructuring process, which I'm sure you'll tell us a little bit more about in our conversation. But I really want to start with you here because we've heard it from Mr. President. But the reality is that a lot of countries find themselves in a very distressful situation right now from an economic perspective. How did we get here? And perhaps take that baton further and explain to us about how some of the economic policies that we're seeing here in the global north, how they're directly impacting on the global south.
Good, Christina. So what the President explains, it's an issue in an increasing number of countries today. We are seeing a problem of sovereign debt distress in the developing world. This is particularly bad in the group of low-income countries. The IMF reports that today 60% of the low-income economies are in situation of debt distress. And how did we get here? I would say that there was a sequence of critical shocks over the last 15 years. First, 2008, Lehman Brothers fall, the financial crisis that starts in the US, the response of the US government, the bailout, and the quantitative easing policy in advanced economies, that meant a massive creation of liquidity that became global. Yeah. So we saw a large number of countries that had never placed bonds in the international capital markets that for the first time they did it, and others that had lost access that recover access eventually. And that led to increases in global debt levels, but particularly in the countries that are suffering the crisis today. Then we had COVID. And COVID...
I just want to bring you back to that point, particularly because of those high interest rates that these countries were given. So they had access to the credit markets.
So that's a good point, because it was a law of zero interest rates, but in the advanced economies. So there was a search for yields. And that in the developing economies is riskier, and therefore the yields are higher. But that also means that there is a probability that is acknowledged that things may go wrong.
Right.
Okay? COVID put more stress on the public finances. For some countries, this just creates intergenerational problems, but for others, it creates sustainability problems. Okay. And then we had the war in Ukraine, and the monetary policy response from central banks of advanced economies has been increases in the interest rates and quantitative tightening, which means undoing the liquidity that was created after the 2008 crisis, and that's a process that is going to take some time, I would say a long time, because all this liquidity cannot be undone all of a sudden. So this means more scarce financing and more expensive financing. So we have more countries having trouble in getting the financing for rolling over the debts, and if they If the debts become unsustainable and they keep paying those debts, that means that they get deprived of resources for public policies for economic development, climate, health, education, and our economies enter into a destabilizing dynamic. That's what we're seeing now. And as the president explained, we don't have an international financial architecture that is up to the challenge. There is nothing equivalent to a bankruptcy court for sovereigns in distress. This is a missing piece from the creation of the international financial architecture after the World War II. So what we see is conflict at different levels between the debtor and the creditors and among the creditors. That's the picture we have now.
Okay, Vera, perhaps maybe you can weigh in here and zone in specifically on the African context in all of this.
Yes, no, thank you. First of all, let me thank the Berlin Global Dialogue for having us here and for being at this prestigious now European business school, the ESMT. I want to start by saying, I think it's what Martín has just spoken about. First of all, we had liquidity in the economies because of the additional liquidity that the United States put in 2008. In 2008, we learned something. Put liquidity into the system, and you can ensure, at least in the developed world, that we don't have a recession.
Right.
In 2020, but we did it late in 2008, so there was a little bit of, by the time the TAP program came into place, the economies of the developed world were already skidding. So in 2020, what happened is the minute we had a crisis, the COVID came in, the governments did the right thing. They said, oh my God, we learned from 2008, we have to put liquidity into the system. They put $20 trillion into the system to make sure that there was a bottom to any kind of sort of crisis. This liquidity essentially then, propped up demand in the West and, raised prices, and so it came back as inflation a little bit later on, of course, accentuated a little bit by the war in Iraq, in Ukraine. And what happened with the developing world was, and we all talked about the special drawing rights when COVID happened and the need for special drawing rights. $650 billion of special drawing rights were released. Africa only got 5%, $35.5 billion. The special drawing rights essentially stayed, again, additional liquidity in the developed world. And so what happened, and I always say sometimes that we have to be careful when we talk about countries that are indebted, because with the tightening, we've seen interest rates rise of 10 times from January 2022 to March 2023. In that period of time, African currencies have suffered a depreciation of 8%. Our debt to GDP levels, without going back to the markets, have increased by 10%. This is not through any issue of sort of poor policy reform. It's just an increase and a tightening of monetary policy in the United States. Now, when you see something like this, the equivalent is, Silicon Valley Bank or something. You run into a liquidity crisis in our economies because all of a sudden your debt obligations increase.
Right.
You were not planning them. You didn't have fiscal space. You didn't provide for that. Now, rather than having the IMF come in and give you a quick sort of stopgap measure, you send to the IMF, if you're on an SBA program, it will take you 2-3 years with conditionality. By then, you actually gone from liquidity to insolvency. What we saw in the United States is when the private and corporate sector went into a liquidity crisis, we gave them some liquidity to make sure that they could go over. And we need to be careful, I think, when we do this, to say that when we have these global external shocks, and we talked about it in the first session, we don't yet have a global system for managing liquidity appropriately. We have a system, we're trying to have a system for managing debt. Yeah. The G20 Common Framework doesn't work, right? So even when you say, okay, it's not a liquidity problem, it's a debt problem, yeah. How do we solve it? It takes 3 years for Zambia to get its problem solved. So again, remember, with the tightening in the United States, 8% depreciation, 10% increase in debt, with nothing that happens. Now, the second big issue is the multilateral development banks. If the multilateral development banks had additional resources, many of these countries will not go to market. And just to give you an example, from 5 years to 2021, African countries went to market and raised about $23 billion. Yes. They're going to pay $13 billion in interest. $23 billion, they will pay $13 billion. If they were borrowing from the World Bank, yeah. They will be paying $2.7 billion. So $11 billion they could use and spend for development.
Yeah.
It's not bad to go to the markets. And this is the final point. But now what we need to also do is, if we realize that the MDBs don't have enough resources, then we must make sure that the cost of money in the markets is commensurate to the risk in those countries, which today it is most often not. And so what we're trying to do in institutions like mine is create secondary markets where we can then create more liquidity in those markets, reduce the cost of money so more people can borrow. If you're Greece and you're Cote d'Ivoire and you go to the markets, the cost of borrowing is much, much higher for Cote d'Ivoire. Same macroeconomic fundamentals, because Greece has the ECB and the euro backing it, and Cote d'Ivoire doesn't. But also Greece has a secondary market, and Cote d'Ivoire doesn't. We must begin to put in better financial and capital markets infrastructure to help these developing countries also face this debt in a way that is sustainable.
And I'll ask you to park on that point, because Samy, I think this is where you come into the conversation. You are the culprits, so to say, right? So when the sovereigns come to the market, these are the interest rates. Just give us your perspective there.
Sure. So I'm the private sector lender at the table. I usually would sit by the door, but you have me trapped in the middle of the room, and that's okay. In all seriousness, I appreciate the invitation.
You won't be able to get out, I've made sure.
So Martín raised a really good point. Easy liquidity, money flowing into emerging markets. But let's take a step back here. In the last 15 years, 95%, over 95% of the debt issued into emerging markets was performing debt. It either matured or is out in the market and not defaulted status. So I'm absolutely open to discussions around reforming the cases. There are 15 countries tragically in default or in debt distress today, and we need to have a conversation around that. But that conversation needs to happen in a way such that we protect the rest of the capital flow that was having a positive outcome. And let me get the bad news out of the way first. The US drives the capital account. China drives the current account. What mostly leads to EM currency outcomes is the dollar. And then here's the worst part of the bad news. In a developed market, when bad things happen, bond yields go down. It becomes cheaper to refinance your issues. In an emerging market or a developing country, when bad things happen, bond yields go up.
Yeah.
It's the opposite problem. And that condition, unfortunately, is unchanged. We could go through the 200-year history of this market. I could go back to the 1970s when Nixon's Treasury Secretary was saying the dollar is our currency and it's your problem. These aren't new topics.
Yeah.
These are aged and unfortunately still with us. What I don't want to remove from all this is human agency. And on the panel before us, we had Minister Muliani, who has made an amazing contribution to her country. 10 years ago in the press, you would hear this horrible term. It's a regressive term. It was called the Fragile Five. And the media brands these countries as all having the same problem. And Indonesia was one of the countries in that category. After over a decade of very strong policy matrix and outcomes, Indonesia was one of the most resilient emerging market economies into and out of COVID. The debt to GDP is over 40%. And at the end of the day, that's human action. We should praise the civil servants who made those decisions. You can't have sustainability without debt sustainability. So I think we're going to play our role. We're happy to contribute to the conversation as long as we keep the capital flowing into developing countries. Over 95% of it was performing. And then we also need to have that shared accountability such that human agency matters. And we need to elevate and praise the work of the civil servants who've made those contributions.
I think I want to stay on you. What do you make of what you're hearing? What role would you like to see the private sector be playing, Martín?
So today, the nature of the coordination among creditors is quite different than in the 1980s, when we had a wave of debt crisis, mostly in Latin America and in Eastern Europe. By then, the main form of private financing was bank loans. Yeah. And today, the market is dominated by bonds. So the number of financiers is much larger, and also the official lending composition is different. Here, the new big player is China. And in the 80s, China was non-existent. So the weight of the Paris Club creditors has diminished relative to what it used to be. So I think the main problem is going to be how to resolve the problem of inter-creditor coordination in a way that ensures sufficient relief, debt relief to countries in distress in order to even have a chance to restore macroeconomic sustainability. One of the issues that has not been touched upon so far in this discussion, and is very important for Sri Lanka actually, is how domestic debts, debts denominated in domestic currencies are treated. And this is a new discussion, a very important one, because the way in which the losses in the debt crisis are distributed matters not just for the creditors, but also for the debtor. And one of the problems that we have now is that all these countries in crisis borrow in a currency that is different than the currency they can issue. So that creates a currency mismatch. And protecting the domestic debt market, the domestic currency debt market, is critical for the future economic development prospects of those countries. We're seeing, perhaps you can, Samy, also comment on that, but we're seeing sort of, in my view, a dangerous situation in which there is advocacy for treating domestic currency debts in ways that would undermine the future development of domestic capital markets, and therefore the prospects of investment for including climate transition.
I think going by Sri Lanka's experience, as far as domestic debt restructuring is concerned, we have limited it to the provident funds. Our banks are not in a position to undertake this. It's already, many of the banks are faced with bad debts, non-performing debts. So we've taken it off, but we've given a guarantee that we'll give a minimum of 9%, which is what members are receiving for the next 3 years, and that will go into legislation. We had to find a way out. This may not have been the best way out, but the one that had the least amount of pressure as far as the population is concerned. The second item, which is far more important, is how do we negotiate? We have the Paris Club, but then our largest bilateral debtors are outside Paris Club,
China.
India and China. Then we have the London Club. So as regards the Paris Club, now India has decided to go along with Paris Club, have a single platform. But China doesn't want to get onto that platform. Now this has nothing to do with Sri Lanka. We are only caught in a geopolitical rivalry. In any case, we are now talking with China, and so far the discussions have been positive. So we have to talk with the Paris Club plus India, then we'll talk to China, and then we go back into the London Club. It's a difficult process. For many countries, I know they won't make it there. And to begin with, it's going to take time. But at the same time, you have no gap financing, as we found out. Having gone through all this, there must be a gap financing. For Sri Lanka, it was difficult. I mean, basically, we had no petrol, we had no fertilizer, people out on the street, the government broke down, houses, all our houses were set on fire. So you have to work on the basis of a solution which also ensures stability. Now, some of the proposals put forward will not ensure stability. There's a point beyond which you can burden the people at this instance. Now, we are going beyond that point. Can you do it? So these are the two major issues we got through on the domestic debt restructuring, but looking at it, I think some of the other countries won't get through. You've got to get into that situation, see what help you have to give in that situation. Secondly, as the crisis occurs, you should be able to come in and give assistance. It's not that we haven't done it before. And for the middle-income countries, there's nothing at all. I mean, basically, we had to find our way through. There should be some window for the middle-income countries. So these are, as you say, the problems we are facing, and it's growing daily and not in any way reducing.
So I can add a few comments. So I'm struck with the feeling first of responsibility, right? And so anyone who manages their client's financial security should have a feeling of responsibility. For a developing country investor, that's an additional burden on his or her shoulders. It's not just a bond with a coupon. This is how a country navigates between its present and its future, and so you have a responsibility to manage it as such. Now we're talking about the topic of inter-creditor coordination in a world that has new constituents of bilateral lenders and domestic debt that maybe didn't exist in the architecture in the past. Every time I end up on the other side of a table with a government that's in default, the first thing I will say is, let's not be here again in 5 years. Let's do this once, and let's get it right. That requires two things. So it requires something I can help control, and then it requires the other multilateral constituents. So starting with the responsibility is inter-creditor coordination. In the case of Sri Lanka, there's one bondholder committee. We don't want to give the country another committee. One committee, one voice to engage in that. Second, I think the bond documents that exist in the market today have made an important transfer of value from the creditor to the debtor. In the old days, in the 80s, you'd have a very restrictive bond document without a collective action clause. A very technical term for some in the room. Martín knows what I'm talking about. But we've weakened those covenants such that you could vote the bonds with only 50% in many cases. What that means is there's a path to a quicker transaction. Before these changes were made, led by ICMA and others, it would take 3 years in the 80s to do a sovereign debt restructuring, 3 years. Post that change, on average, it's been about a year. Now, it certainly can take longer, and there's other cases where we can talk about why it takes longer, but the average has come down because of that transfer of value back to the debtor. That's on the coordination piece, but at the end of the day, if it's going to be done sustainably, the government needs to engage all of its debtors, and the very difficult decisions associated with the domestic debt operation were done in Sri Lanka. So now it's time for the private sector to do its part as well.
Yes, Vera.
No, I just wanted to come in on 3 points. I think we tend to, and I really want to emphasize this, we tend to sort of have debt as a sort of negative connotative term, right? But some debt is good, because if we don't have additional debt, we cannot grow. And I'm going to the MDBs again. I'm coming back to the MDBs. One of the reasons why we talk about MDB reform and we're asking shareholders to put resources in the MDBs is that countries went to market, and they should continue to go to market, but they had to borrow more than they could sustainably contain with market rates. The reason being that resources in the World Bank and the EIB and all that were becoming scarce. We know that in the developing world today, in the developed world today, you know, there's economic difficulty, climate change is causing and putting a lot of pressure on budgets. But I think it is important to continue to make sure that the work that, you know, institutions in Germany, for example, the Global Perspectives Initiative, and I see Ingrid Ham here, the CIO, and a lot of others are doing to ensure that there is contribution to the MDB agenda and additional resources. We say that the world needs, we just did a report, myself and Lord Stern, on, you know, climate finance. We need $2.4 trillion for climate finance, of which we need at least 260 billion from the global multilateral development banks. Today we only have 100 billion. If we can raise 260 billion from the MDBs, we can leverage the private sector for $1 trillion. Then we begin to actually talk about how we can grow. Because I worry sometimes that if we just continue the debate on debt, we're not talking about growth. We're not talking about prosperity. We're not talking about livelihoods. We're not talking about the new, you know, revolution, which is green, which is digital, which is AI-enabled, right? I think that that's what we should be worrying about, is how do we finance that in a way that makes sure that countries don't fall behind. And the one way to do that, the sure way to do that, is clearly domestic resource mobilization. And I go back to the conversation we had again before on carbon financing and carbon markets. The fastest way for a lot of developing countries to get additional resources into their fiscal space is to put a price on carbon. Because many of the developing economies actually have assets that they can put to bear. You know, today, $1 trillion is being made because of the war in Iraq, in Ukraine, sorry, by 5 countries. Norway, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the others. Thank God, in the Africa Climate Summit, the UAE pledged $4.5 billion to help the African economies. But the Bridgetown Initiative is talking about a tax. And this is $1 trillion that 5 countries got as a windfall because of the war in Ukraine. Can we at least put that to development? Can we do that in a way that makes sure that, we don't have another pandemic where low-income countries don't know how to get out? When we talk about this last 4 years, only 5 countries have actually sort of gone into default. The others have been resilient. I think our challenge over the next 7 years to the end of the SDGs is how we go from resilience to growth, not how we go from resilience to debt. Or debt distress, right? And I think this is the challenge for the world. And we know where we can get those resources. We can leverage the MDBs. I know that countries like Germany, countries like the UK, countries like the United States are still struggling with their contributions. We heard the EU president say that, we are contributing today to the MDB system less than we did 10 years ago. I think we need to restructure that. We need to make it better. There is no way that we can get out of this process if we don't do that. And the resources, again, is really to bring the private sector to the table. The Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero has $136 trillion. They need to abate their climate emissions. They have resources that they want to put behind development and behind growth. But we need to put these multilateral frameworks. The MDB framework is one, but there is an important governance framework around carbon markets, around climate change that needs to be put in place. And my sense is the conversation we're having, and this sort of subject today is global perspectives, is that we are lacking global governance in many places. We're lacking global governance in the financial sector. We're lacking global governance in the carbon and climate sector to put a price to it so that we can actually go forward. And we're lacking global governance on peace and security. In my continent, of course, but in most continents, I think we continue to see the rise of crises which could be abated if we had a better governance system.
No, I agree with you. There has to be a growth strategy. That's why I raised this issue. For us in Asia, what is the growth strategy? We've been going on one strategy, and you are changing it overnight. What do small countries like us do? We only got the crumbs of the Washington consensus. Now, if you take it off, we won't have those crumbs even. Secondly, Asia, whether we like it or not, is also dependent on the prosperity of China.
Yep.
And if China comes down, it affects all of us. And invariably, China might survive, we may go down. And we are now getting caught into this whole, the geopolitics. One is that we never got the full benefit, certainly not Indian Ocean, of the Washington consensus. In any case, we have to make it on our own. On the other hand, what was available to us was funding from Japan and China. China meant joining the BRI. We've got projects there. Some good, some not that. But that's our fault. We are the ones who selected it. But now we are getting, all of us get targeted if you're on the BRI. So you can't get any assistance from China. You're not getting assistance from elsewhere. Now we are trying to enter the markets. For the first time, we are the first country outside Southeast Asia to join, asked to join the RCEP. So as we are trying to play with the existing rules, we find the rules are being changed. Mm-hmm. And if this is difficult for us, it's going to be more difficult for Africa. I mean, this is what all of us realize. And then the outcome of G20 this time was not fruitful at all. There was nothing in it for countries like Sri Lanka and many other countries. So you may now find a geopolitical split with BRICS, with Russia and China, with Quad plus part of them. But we get caught into all this, and we are the ones who suffer.
Sorry, Samy, please go ahead, because I want to take the conversation into a different tone, so please proceed quickly.
I appreciate that, Christine. Just one comment to build on the last 2 points, which involved resource mobilization in a time of tighter financial conditions. And it also ties into your point on domestic debt treatment, is an issue of tax revenue. So it is not uncommon in a developing country that 15 to 30% or more of the available financial taxable resources in the country are held abroad. And I've seen countries where it's over 50%. It's very difficult to run a public sector and provide the social help needed, particularly in poorer populations, when the tax revenue to GDP is below 20% in some cases. In Europe, is twice that amount. My first job, I'm a private sector person. My first job was in the public sector. The interns or the college students in the room can listen to this story, maybe appreciate it. I had the worst internship you could ever have. I was a tax collector in a developing part of the Middle East where my family's from, in a place where tax evasion is a cultural sport. And so the best method we came up with is we would let the trash pile up, and then we would go door to door and say, if you want your garbage collected, please pay your taxes. So when you think about your bad internship students, you can think about walking along the streets collecting taxes amidst the garbage. But the moral of that story is if the resources abroad are going to be tighter, you can't plug a deficit by cheap borrowing abroad. We need to have a more efficient tax capacity and the institutional support from the DC-based institutions to help enable that tax capacity.
Thank you, Samy. I'm just looking at the clock now, and we do want to make time for audience Q&A. But Martin, I think let's pivot in the direction of the solutions that we need for the current debt crisis. I know Vera's emphasis is really the growth aspect, but I would like for us to discuss the solutions here. How can the international financial architecture be improved in that regard?
Good. So ideally, what we should want, actually what we want, is an international financial architecture that contributes to the goals of global prosperity, but not just prosperity, I would say shared prosperity. What's here at stake in parts of the world, it's not just the future of their economies, but also the future of their political systems. And the capacity of these economies to adopt the transformation policies for adapting to a world in which, as we've heard in the previous discussion, there will be a more aggressive, reasonably more aggressive carbon pricing. And those economies that don't adapt to those climate policies will have more trouble competing internationally, and they will lag behind more than they are now. So this is a very important discussion for the Southern Hemisphere. One could wonder whether this crisis in the Global South will have systemic consequences, whether they will affect the North. And probably not directly, but there is always one channel that is present, which is migration, that creates political troubles in the North as well. So what do we need to achieve here? As we said before, there should be sustainable restructuring processes, and this will require the cooperation from the international community in a global environment that is less prone to cooperation, right? But Vera made a very important point, which is the role of the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, the role of official multilateral financing in general. So over the last few decades, and especially over the last 20 years, we had this massive growth in private liquidity, but the financing capacity from the official sectors did not keep up. And what we actually saw in large parts of the world is a change in the relative strength of the states vis-a-vis the private sector. This is what we're seeing, for instance, in Latin America today. States are weaker vis-a-vis the private sector. They're more indebted, and this changes entire politics in the continent. So we need reform that is comprehensive, that includes what's done at the level of the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the IDB, the CAF, the African Development Bank, the lending models, and the IMF as well. The IMF, an important player here. I know Sri Lanka is having to deal with the IMF at the moment. I had to negotiate the largest refinancing loan ever with the IMF, so I could say a few words about that. But the IMF is supposed to play a counter-cyclical role in the global economy, and it doesn't. Today, the IMF lending rates, the interest rate at which the IMF lends, is not determined by a formula of the IMF. It's determined by the monetary policy in the US, in the UK, in Europe, Japan, and China, the 5 countries that issue reserve currencies. The interest rates of those countries, of the determined by central banks of those countries, determine the rate at which Sri Lanka borrows from the IMF. So that really makes no sense. So I think we need comprehensive reform. The G20 is an important forum, and now we have the end of the Indian presidency, and the Brazilian president comes next, and I'm sure this is going to be an important theme in the agenda of the G20.
I just want to take a look around the room now. Do we have any questions at the moment? Any questions from the floor?
While you're waiting for questions, maybe I come in. I think one of the things that we have in the multilateral system is the IMF is not designed to be a liquidity provider. And so when you have a crisis, you know, the IMF has the precautionary lending lines, and those essentially are for countries in good standing. So if you have a crisis, you can use that. Or they have the standby agreement, but the standby agreement takes a year or 2 to get into place. What we need from the IMF today, and the central banks in the developed countries are doing that already, is you need a liquidity line where if interest rates spike and you're a country that needs to do a payment, you can at least draw on that and do that payment so that you don't go from this sort of lack of liquidity into a debt and crisis situation which takes you even longer. And I think the reform of the IMF needs to look at that. There are also quota limits at the IMF, which were done when countries were much smaller and growing much slower. And now with, you know, huge revisions in growth in many countries, you know, single borrower limits and things like that, they've exhausted their lending capacity, which again forces them to go to the market at much higher rates. So if we really want global growth, I think we need to look at how we can use some of these multilateral institutions and the IMF, reduce the cost of borrowing from them. They will always need to complement lending from the private sector because this is important. But at least we should see that, particularly, and I think one of the things that we're talking about in Bridgetown and other places is we should not expect developing countries to borrow and get additional debt to fight climate. It's just impossible to keep, you know, adding additional debt for climate. And so we need to find a way of getting cheaper resources to make sure that, you know, countries like Indonesia, Sri Lanka, my own, and others can actually address the climate problem. I'm fortunate I come from an Amazon basin type country. So we want carbon financing because from that we can sort of plow back. And finally, I think on this industrial policy, where is the growth strategy? We are living in a time now where industrial policy in the developed economy has become particularly crucial. We spent a lot of time in the Washington Consensus saying industrial policy was not necessarily the best thing to do. But I think we are seeing a renewed conversation around what is the best take on industrial policy and how can we do it. And their countries have an obligation, I think, to make sure that they design their own industrial policies in a way that delivers growth for them. And this, I think, must be the onus, the responsibility of the countries. And Minister Sri Mulyani can talk about Indonesia doing well because they have taken ownership of their growth strategy and they are able to bring it to the rest of the world and say, fund this. And I think this is going to be an important crux of how we go forward. It's not MDBs telling countries what to do, but countries putting forward a development plan that then is financed in a sustainable way.
As you said, who provides liquidity is an important question. Now, our experience, actually, there were no institutions to provide liquidity. Fortunately for us, India came up with $3.5 billion, and our friend Bangladesh with another $200 million, which they could ill afford, but they gave us. So we had this money, and then we had, as I said, the re-graduation and the money that we got from US. But there is no institutional framework for countries. So in between, a few governments can fall between declaring bankruptcy. And so your political stabilization, your political stability is affected, in turn affecting your economic stabilization.
If I can just add one point on this and also invite questions from the audience. So before I offer a critique of the IMF, I think it needs to be said that the IMF also does a lot of good things. The monitoring that the IMF provides makes it easier for me to invest money into developing countries. So most of my business, $25 billion, is supported by IMF staff engagement, and they're some of the world's best economists that put their heart and soul into that work. Secondly, for every program that's critiqued, there's also a number of programs that had created some success. Angola, Oman, Mongolia.
So this is not a critique of the IMF. This is a critique of the shareholders of the IMF to strengthen their mandate and to give them additional resources.
So let's get into what those leaders can do to actually drive an outcome. So two things I'd offer, and these are quite specific. So making it easier to lend into arrears and including official arrears, because we don't have time to wait, and it's scarring for a country and also quite destructive to find some other liquidity provider in that interim period. Second, to do a debt restructuring on a market access country, there's a tried and tested path. Sri Lanka is among those. There's a new framework never meant for debt restructurings called a lower income country threshold. And those two things need to be converged sooner than later, because it leads to very divergent outcomes on a country's debt carrying capacity.
I'm interested to know your thoughts on that, Martin.
One clarification for our audience, because the term lending into arrears may not be familiar to most of the audience. So the IMF is supposed to play the role of the lender of last resort. It's the institution that, it's not a commercial bank. So it's supposed not to make a profit out of lending, but it's a multilateral institution that was created in 1945 to contribute to the stability of the balance of payments at the global level, such that we have a more stable world, which would also contribute to a more peaceful world. And there are situations in which countries just can't pay, and can't pay to either private creditors or to official creditors, meaning other countries. And the IMF has to make a decision on whether, even if the country is not paying, meaning it's in arrears with other creditors, whether it lends or not. And what Samy points out is that this is an important policy, because the country may be suffering. You know, when you have a crisis, poverty is going up, unemployment is going up, and waiting until, say, China says, all right, I'm going to provide the assurance that the debt with us will be restructured, may just lead to more pain in the country. So the IMF has the possibility of lending anyways. And that's certainly an important tool. It's used with private creditors. It's less used with official creditors. But given where the war is going, it's important to consider a more active use of that policy for performing this role of lender of last resort.
Okay. And
I see a question behind.
Martín. Oh, yes.
Yeah, thank you to all the panelists for the excellent inputs, very interesting. My name is Janne Horace, I'm an advisor in the debt space. I would be interested in hearing from you more about what instruments particularly you favor to make that connection between finding investment in funds and putting them into the adaptation and mitigation measures that are so needed, because the Western countries, the US and the EU, are not the countries that have the highest CO2 emissions anymore globally. So yeah, thank you very much, and I would be very interested in hearing your perspectives on that.
Thank you. I think, Vera, that's a good one for you.
Now, and that's an important question. I think, again, we heard the President of the EU Commission talk about carbon financing. Unfortunately, of the $300 billion of bonds that have been issued out there for carbon and climate financing, only about 3% to 5% is really in the low-income countries, and about 7% in the sort of emerging world at large. And one of the reasons is because we talk about ESG washing, is the sort of credibility of the projects that underlie this funding. And so one of the things that will be important to do is provide guarantees, blended financing, and for the multilateral and official sectors to actually maybe put some equity in these projects so that they can actually walk it through. But there is also, I think, a governance system that is important to create, you know, the credibility of the monitoring, the verification systems in these processes. And I always wonder, you know, we have a voluntary market in Europe which is working well. We know how it works. And for the developing world, it's taking so long to sort of set up a basic framework that will give us additional resources so we don't have to fall into debt. And And you know, now there's scope 1, scope 2, you know, science-based targets and initiatives, and they've made it so complicated that the private sector is afraid to move. And I think what we need to do is simplify the process, get, you know, a few verification agencies that can tell us what is needed, so that this trillions of dollars with Mark Carney and the rest can actually come in. And I think that's the first one. The second is for the MDBs, and the JETPs. One of the things that is missing from the carbon space and the climate space, and we're working in it, and certainly you are, is the financing of the transition. It is incredibly important to finance the transition. Yeah. It's one thing to say, and we all talk about, you know, solar costs have gone down. I always ask myself, if solar costs have gone down, why is the IRA subsidizing solar in the United States? They haven't gone that low, right? They're still expensive for the last mile countries. And so you need some additional concessional financing to do that. And what we need to do, again, is to create value chains and supply chains. I think one of the dangers is, as we all talk about it, and we say that, you know, the next century is going to be a green century for growth, that growth must be felt in the developing countries as well. You have to be able to go to a Sri Lanka, a Cameroon, a Cote d'Ivoire, and Brazil, and say our EV industry is booming because we're doing climate, or our, you know, cement industry. And my last point is the CBAM, you know, this carbon border assessment mechanism that has been put into the EU. It's a great climate measure. But it really is a non-tariff trade barrier, which is making it very difficult because there's no transition period yet. So if you're Egypt, whose large exports is steel, cement, and you're locked out of the market. So you're going to get poorer, you're going to get a debt crisis, you're going to have to go. So I think we need to look at how we transition out of this CO2 economy into a more permanent, clean economy, but in a way where access to financing is cheaper and where policy is consistent.
Thank you. We have another. Did you want to say something, Martín? Or can I go to the... Okay, let's take the question, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wangari Mwekia. I am a public finance management specialist at Expertise Global Consulting. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. I have a question around the perceptions and the ratings when it comes to developing countries. There's a mismatch between the fiscal context between the countries and their credit ratings. So in case in point, for example, Argentina, Angola, where Argentina has had trouble, I think about 9 times, not been able to meet their obligations, where Angola hasn't had those type of problems and have had to face higher rates. And Angola, on top of that, have higher savings. So yes, I'm trying to understand what is the problem there and what is a mismatch. I think there's a challenge there. And I know African countries have had checkered past when it comes to credit reliefs and restructuring, but the gap doesn't really justify that. And then just a follow-up question in terms of the LMICs. The negative ratings also and the lack of understanding when it comes to these contexts cut them out of accessing, I think, approximately $900 million when it comes to the MDBs. And the question is, how can we then rethink how the MDBs are lending to developing countries, and you know, to get your perspective from that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would gladly say I have the answers to those questions, but I will hand over to you because it is your job as panelists today to be answering those questions.
I could offer an answer on that. So take the case of India. India's BBB- rated. It was BBB- rated years before COVID with 300 billion reserves. It's BBB- rated today with 600 billion of reserves. Furthermore, due to strong decision-making at the Ministry of Finance, India has approximately $0.0 of foreign external debt. So $600 billion of reserves, 0 foreign debt. Somehow that's BBB-. I'm sorry, but my only answer to you is that don't rely on a credit rating. It's a very linear way of thinking. Iceland was once rated AAA. Dr. Guzmán, the problems that he inherited in his role and had to exhibit the leadership to manage out of that, it happened almost overnight. So I'm happy to sidebar with you and talk you through the way that we do it in industry, but the linear way of thinking associated with the credit rating is not really going to help us here.
Let me just normally what happens with the credit rating agencies is what I call a stack system, right? They have the macroeconomic fundamentals that they access. Then they have a perception, which is what you've just addressed, and this perception problem we have to deal with. No emerging market economy is rated AA. Forget AAA, none. None of us is good enough, and this is a problem. No, across the world, so it's not just Africa, but across the world, and I think we do need to question that. And then the third stack is a liquidity stack, which is that because there is not an active secondary market for a lot of emerging market paper, what bondholders do is they buy the paper and they keep it. And the cost of keeping that paper is priced into the cost of the paper, right? And so sometimes it's 200 basis points for the illiquidity of the paper. So that's what we're doing by creating the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility. In the United States, there is a repo market where you buy the bond in the morning, in 5 minutes you can repo it. It's a $5 trillion sort of recycling of liquidity market that allows for investors to go back into the markets. It's important for emerging markets because we heard Bernie Mensa and all the big capitalists here this morning. They have sort of maximum exposure limits into our economies. Once they've bought 2 or 3 bonds, if they cannot resell those bonds, they can never come back into our economy until the maturity of that paper, which means that if JP Morgan comes in 1 year, they have to wait another 3, 4, 5 years. With a liquidity market, you can sort of recycle that bond, sell it to somebody, and go back into that market. And we're missing that part. So not only are we missing additional investment, but it's also costing us an additional in the basis points for the resources. So we need to deepen our capital markets to make sure that that can work well.
Can I take this question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for taking my question. My name is Unkutle Motlogelwa. I'm with the Young Voices. I'm from Botswana. I'm with University of Cape Town in South Africa. So my question, my background is in mining engineering, so I'm a mining engineer by profession. And I'm going to link the previous session to my question today to say the developing nations historically use natural resources to be able to get to the point where they're at. And currently the developing nations have natural resources. The coal in Botswana and South Africa is underground, and we are calling them to transition to green energy and stop extracting what's already there underground for them to use. So my question is to say, what's your view? We are asking them to not extract, but they have to be able to secure funding. So how do we strike the balance between the green energy and allowing them to extract that resources to be able to extract or secure funding?
I think this is that just element in the transition. Who would like to take this one?
I can, if I may, I can add a few remarks on this general problem of financing for the climate transition.
Yes.
First, we have to understand that the environment is a global public good. So any investment for improving the sustainability of our environment has positive externalities. And naturally, the definition of an externality is that it's not internalized by private actors. So the problem of financing, it won't be resolved through the decentralized market economy. So we have to focus on 2 avenues, taxes and finance. For the states, the main concern with the international tax architecture is the tax havens. It just went too far. And that's what gave rise to the idea of a global tax solution, which was discussed at the OECD with a steering committee that included about 190 countries to put a minimum global tax rate of 15% plus a system for redistributing, or a system for distributing the tax revenues that will be collected on multinational corporations. Unfortunately, there's been no progress. It's probably going to die, so the US Congress will likely not approve it. But that's one of the top concerns for states. And on the financing side, so there are 3 parts: the private sector, the MDBs, and I will put the IMF aside. On the private sector, this is perhaps a question more for Samy. The question is, what can we do in order to reflect a price for financing that internalizes the positive spillovers associated with climate investments. Okay? And then we need more financing from the MDBs. And also the IMF should take a more active role on climate financing, because climate is not just a development issue, it's a macroeconomic issue. Countries that don't adapt their structures of production this decade will have trouble competing internationally next decade, and therefore they will have more balance of payments or sovereign debt crisis.
Okay. In the absence of more questions, and I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that, but I think I would like to bring our conversation to a close because we are standing in the way of lunch and everybody. But I think I will allow you to just make your concluding remarks, and maybe you want to answer one of that questions that came through from Martin. But perhaps let's start with you, Samy, Martin, Vera, and then we'll finish with you, Mr. President.
Sure. My closing remark is that sustainability starts with debt sustainability, and the private sector is here to play a constructive role in that.
I agree.
You agree? Easy.
If you grow, you don't have a debt problem, or you can grow out of your debt problem. So we must build growth strategies to be able to allow countries to transition, but to transition in a way that is inclusive and delivers growth and prosperity.
Mr. President, final word from you.
I would agree with on the growth strategies. We need a growth strategy for our part of the world.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really sound way to end this conversation. Much appreciated once again to, of course, our special guest, President Wickremesinghe, the President of Sri Lanka, to Vera Songwe, Chair of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, Samy Muaddi, Head of Emerging Markets Fixed Income at T. Rowe Price, and of course Martín Guzmán, former Minister of Economy in Argentina and visiting professor at Columbia University. Thank you so much, friends, and let's keep further.
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
Thanks.
I think.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you,
You were
everybody.
great.
Thanks very much.